Well, welcome to BaseCamp Live. Davies Owens here in the studio today with Maryellen St. and David Goodwin, president of the ACCS. How you doing, David?
Good to be here. I'm doing well.
I always pull David in and say, David, you got to come be a part of this interview. We've got Maryellen St. here. How you doing, Maryellen? Welcome.
I'm doing well.
It's good to have you here. You know, folks get to hear from your better half, or maybe you're the better half. I don't know. Bill St. A few episodes back talking about Charlotte Mason. So we're excited to have you here. I would love for folks to hear your story and just sort of who is Charlotte Mason, but how did you come to find her? You were teaching, and what was the story?
So I was teaching at a Christian school and it was my 10th year, and I began thinking about, is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? I had already become disenchanted with education, and I thought surely we could do better, especially in the name of Christ. I didn't really know how or what, but I knew it could be better. And so I began this personal pursuit of what is a good Christian education. I came across the writings of the British educator, Charlotte Mason, and I began to read, and I began to grow, and I began to change, and I began to know things that I was looking for, and get the knowledge that I was seeking. And as I began to grow, my students began to grow, and they began to change, and people noticed, their parents noticed. And one of the things about Charlotte Mason that
you were well. I want to hold on because I want to back up for 1 second. So you were in what I like to call generic Christian school. So it wasn't a classical Christian school. You were
Correct.
In Atlanta, my hometown, not far from you there back in the day, and you were just trying to supplement and add to the curriculum. You weren't in something, and you went to England. You actually met people, I guess, who had some connection back to the schools that were there.
Correct. So Susan Schafer McCullough, she and her husband Ranald were doing a L'Abri conference in Atlanta.
Okay.
She came to visit my classroom and spent some time and invited me to go to L'Abri, and that she said she would be my tutor, so that I took the chance that summer and
wow.
Spent 3 months there and enjoyed it.
A little footnote on that. When I was 18, I was at L'Abri in Switzerland, and I remember Susan had adopted, I guess there were 2 younger children that came later in their life, and she was raising them. And I remember thinking as an 18-year-old, no thoughts of kids at that point, but I thought, these are the most unique kids I've ever seen. They're putting on a Shakespeare play for fun. I thought, what are you doing to them? And she said, well, it's this Charlotte Mason classical thing. And I just filed that away. And I would attribute that moment to even a lot of what I'm doing in my life now, because I've seen that impact. So you came back from England and said, we've got to do things differently. You were, I guess, initially maybe going to try to retrofit the school you were in, and then you and Bill said, we just got to start over.
Well, Bill hadn't come into the picture yet.
Oh, okay. I'm getting ahead of things, right?
So then I went to grad school and became a principal of another school that was a sister school of the school I had been a part of, and they gave me the freedom to teach in this way and to instruct the teachers and to move the whole school in this way, and I took advantage of that. And so in 3 years I had students, 80 students and 11 teachers, and we began to practice this, and people began to come and see. And I kept thinking, what would it look like from the ground up? What would it look like from the ground up?
Yeah, and then you had the opportunity in Fredericksburg to start the school from ground up. So there's so much to say about Charlotte Mason. So to kind of jump on this idea of habit training, I think most of us growing up here in the West at some point have heard, somewhere around New Year's resolutions, 30 days to start a good habit, and or after 30 days. And there's some books out there that have been top sellers. There's a book Duhigg wrote called The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg. And he tells these amazing stories, like in 1996, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were one of the worst football teams in the NFL, and he arrived and as head coach began the strategy of forcing players to develop deeply ingrained habits so that they don't even have to think during the game. And it became it literally was a game changer. It changed the entire strategy of the team. So I think just in general, people know habits are a good thing. But I'm curious sort of from an educational standpoint, and David, I know you and I talk a lot about, the deepness of classical Christian education is that we're so much more than just the information we're disseminating. We're forming students. But when we kind of stop there sometimes, and what does it mean to form a student? And I think that's where Charlotte Mason really has this beautiful complement to classical education, saying, let me talk about the actual process of how children are formed and even the brain science. And you married a brain scientist who came back. You were just saying at lunch that you tell that story because you were talking to, I guess, latest bleeding edge scientific studies are coming out, and they're basically saying things that Charlotte Mason figured out 100 years ago about habit formation.
Mm-hmm. So I had read this book called The Mind and the Brain by Jeffrey Schwartz, and when I get excited about a book and an author, I often find them friendly. And so I emailed him and I said, I just wanted to let you know there was a woman who thought the same things you did 100 years ago. And he emailed me back and said she was 100 years ahead of herself. Bravo. And it's really exciting when science catches up with someone that knew the truth long before they did.
100 years ago, yes. Well, all right, so let's talk a little bit. When we talk habit form, what does that mean, and how does that play out in a classroom for you?
So in order to understand what Charlotte Mason says about habit, you have to understand about what we think about children. So Charlotte Mason says children have a nature. That's what they're born with. They have the parents' DNA, they have a family history, they have experiences, they have education, and they also have woundedness. And all of that's put together and it comes to our classroom, or it stays in your homeschool classroom. And she says they have these tendencies. We see that they have the tendency to be shy, or they have the tendency to be friendly. And sometimes when we have a variety of children in our midst, we're grateful for the one shy one and the one friendly one. And so we kind of categorize their weaknesses and their strengths, and we're thankful for their strengths, and we allow the weaknesses to kind of stay dormant and do nothing about them. And so Charlotte Mason said, what would it look like if we can lift these children up, if we could use habit as a lever? Now, living when she did, there wasn't much science and imaging that we have today, but she went every year to Germany and to Berlin, and she met the men of science, and she talked about these things. She read William James out of Harvard, and she wanted to know what were people thinking, because she knew that there were these laws, the laws that God had made in how we work as human beings, and there were laws of habit.
And so, give us an example. I seem to recall it was about 60 things that she identified as a habit. And was it 9 out of 10 things in life she says are habits?
She would say 99% out of life is habit.
And I always like to say, like, go home, if you don't buy that, go home and try to brush your teeth by putting, like, just stick the toothbrush in your mouth. It'll always end up in the same spot. We don't even, I mean, how many things we just are on autopilot? But try brushing on the lower left. If you're on the upper right, it feels weird. It's like your left hand and your right hand. So something's different. But it's all in the subconscious level, which is what she's talking about forming.
Right. So she says that when we think about habit, we need to think about it in terms of not just habits of behavior, but habits of thinking as well. She talks about habits of devotion to God. In fact, she speaks about habit in her 6 volumes over 800 times.
Wow.
And so it's one of the tools we have in order to bring children up. And so we need to give some close attention to it. So in teaching children about habit, she says we could take our role as a parent or a teacher, and we can be too much with the students and kind of bully them into doing what they ought to do. And she said that would be the wrong way of teaching in habit. So as long as we can engage them, and she said one of the first things is to give them an initial idea. So for example, one of the things that I like to do is teach children about how to work well. So I give them the initial idea of that work is a good thing. It was given to us by God. He is asking us to bear dominion in this world in a variety of ways. And if we learn how to work well with handwriting or science or history or literature, then we can learn how to work well when we get older and continue that same process. But giving them a vision for what that looks like. It begins with attention. It begins with approaching work, approaching reading. And so little by little, we hardly ever use the word habit in our schools. We don't put habit on as a weekly thing. It's the habit of the week or a monthly thing. We don't put it on as a veneer. It's just something, the way we do things. Yeah. It's how we set this table.
Yeah, well, I like the idea of just something as simple as working well. We may narrowly think of that working well means you got all of these 10 math problems right. But you're talking about working well was actually how you approached it, the handwriting you used to do it, your level of attentiveness. That's actually considered a habit, the habit of attending. And I think that's profound. So why don't we take a quick break? When we come back, I want to get into more of these habits and not only look at how they play out in the classroom, but just ways that we as parents and those raising the next generation should be encouraging the habits of our children in ways that hopefully will be positive for them. So we'll be right back after the break.
Ambleside Schools International fosters an educational renewal based upon the pedagogical insights of British educator Charlotte Mason. Serving an international community of parents, teachers, and schools, Ambleside makes a living education accessible to all. For additional information regarding Ambleside Schools International and training opportunities for principals, teachers, and parents, please visit our website at amblesidschools.com.
Welcome back to BaseCamp Live. Davies Owens here in the studio with Maryellen St. and David Goodwin. Maryellen, it's so great to have you. You've been an educator for 30 years, I hear. You've been doing this for a while.
A little over 30.
Over 30. I won't press the details, but I'm glad. Needless to say, you've seen a lot in your years. We're talking about the British educator Charlotte Mason and her, in particular, kind of her influence around habit training. And over the break, David, it's interesting. Being the president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools, people wonder what ACCS is. I remember years ago at an ACCS conference, there was a workshop. The name stuck out, and it was entitled "Do Dorothy and Charlotte Get Along?" And it was all about Charlotte Mason, the educator, which many have been influenced by, and then Dorothy Sayers, of course, who wrote in the 40s The Lost Tools of Learning, and people have been, largely motivated to the classical school movement through her. I'm curious. I mean, from your vantage point, where do you see Dorothy and Charlotte getting along? Do they work out pretty well together?
Well, I think in the terms of history, they share a lot because they came at the time when you mentioned William James earlier, when scientism was overtaking how we think about children, and so we reframed all of education around pragmatic science in the early 20th century. And really, Charlotte Mason, the beauty of Charlotte Mason is that she and Dorothy Sayers are on that cusp that they could remember the time when education was much more humane. And it was a humane activity, not a scientific activity. So you see that what Charlotte Mason brings to classical education is very important because, frankly, classical Christian education is simply the way education was done prior to about 1900,
right?
Which means there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. There's a lot of different angles, and I've always, since my early years in classical education, have been enamored by Charlotte Mason and her ideas.
Yeah, and I love it just because she actually says, here's what it looks like in the classroom. And I remember I've said this example maybe before of many classical schools will tout the great books and the trivium, and I can remember websites years ago that was like a 4-foot-tall little girl next to 4-foot-tall book bindings, and you just think are spines of the great books of Western civilization. And on the one hand, you're like, I want my kid to have that. On the other hand, there's probably some weeping and gnashing of teeth.
There's a few habits you have to build before
you
actually
don't
actually
just wow,
read those,
she can win literary challenges and things, but does she love this, and is it part of who she is? Is it formed deeply within her? And I think that's back to where these habits go. So again, when we say habit, Maryellen, I'd love to kind of get practical, like, okay, what are we talking about? But before that, just to make the point, I mean, I think just broadly, if you stop someone on the sidewalk today and you say, what do you think about habit formation, positive or negative? David, you and I were talking about it's probably negative. I mean, most people don't. It's constricting.
We're told today that we need to, be ourselves and press forward into the new and the different and the
find the authentic you.
Yes. And a lot of that doesn't sound like habit.
No.
But in reality, habit.
And children actually love the structure that habits provide. So, Maryellen, help us unpack again. We don't have time for all 60 of the ones that Charlotte Mason identified, but we tend to think of habit like habit of picking up your room or something, as opposed to the habit of fortitude or the habit of attending. So what are some good examples that you've seen?
So, for example, in a class like geography or mathematics, so we ask students to solve problems, we ask them to copy maps, we ask them to label waterways and write down the capitals, and so we look at a map before we even begin, a map that has been printed, and we look at some of the things that it's characterized by: capital letters for countries, capitals beginning with a capital letter, how do they write the waterways, and we look at that and we recall that, and then we copy that. Some child might say, well, I'd like to write all my capitals in orange. Well, that's nice. You can do that on a map at home, but the way we're doing it in school is this, because we're teaching them how to work accurately and in a methodical way, and so that they can learn these capitals and countries and waterways. Right. And so that there is a prescribed way of doing it. It doesn't mean there's only one way, but in a class, students would be spending so much time thinking about what color to choose, or maybe I'll do this, or maybe I'll make the first letter this kind of letter and this. And so then we're wasting all this time with choice. And so this is just the way that we're going to do it. And then in a class like mathematics, the students are working to a level that there is a right and there is a wrong answer, but we might want them to solve the problem in this way. We might want them to draw a picture. We might want them to write the algorithm, not just the answer, and so then they have to do it the way that we ask them to do it. And so we give them a habit of thinking, a habit of working, and then a habit of checking. And so we can ensure a higher level of accuracy when they do as they ought to do.
Mm-hmm. When you're mentioning the map, I can remember going through. I had the privilege of being in Fredericksburg for the full week, and kind of immersive training that you guys do there, and it was really fascinating because for 3 days I was a student carrying my little notebook around and singing the hymns, and then the other 3 days or 4 days I was the teacher, and I remember one of the tools or the techniques it used is the dry brush watercolors, which is I always thought of watercolors as just lots of paint everywhere, and it's just very gently doing it. So in nature studies, you can sketch things, or even in the maps, you're drawing the maps out. And I realized just even as an adult I think we all have ADD today. We all just sort of scatter across the top of something and think we kind of got it. But the forcing of having to, let's draw every detail on the map, every boundary, every river, let's identify it. That is it seems tedious maybe, but it's actually very freeing, and you actually get a chance to see exactly what the author intended, and it's a habit that I think makes you a better student to then have a conversation about the map or about the literary.
Although I think Maryellen committed heresy in the progressive world.
Why?
To stifle a child's creativity.
I know. Well,
I mean, that's heresy.
I know. She did say you can get your orange paints out at home.
At home,
yeah,
yes.
Freely express yourself.
No free expression here.
Right. Well, and by the way, these are some. In case anybody's worried, they're some of the most joyful students I've ever seen in your schools. These are not stifled kids by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway.
Well, and the classical principle behind that is that imitation is the beginning of creativity.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, and it's when I always look to the sports world, because no one who is a coach would ever allow a baseball player to hold the bat at the barrel or at the handle. They would have to hold it on the grip. Mm-hmm. And yet the same way that we think about sports, we want our children to have the right strokes in swimming, etc. But when we think about academic work, we sometimes have a willy-nilly attitude about it. My child likes to do this, my child doesn't like to do this. But really, to be a part of academic work is to train not only the behavior of how to approach the work, but also to how to think about the work. And we all know when we've met someone who can think in a logical way and in a systematic way, and it's really a blessing to be with those people because they unfold things that we wouldn't naturally think of ourselves.
Yeah. So give us another example. What's another habit that we could work on or that you often pursue?
Well, we live in the world of attention deficit today, and you think that it's at an all-time high. Everybody's being diagnosed if they are not giving attention. And so what we do at our schools is we train children how to give attention. So one of the ways we do that is getting rid of all the stuff. We don't allow them to have water bottles or, lots of things on their desk that they can play with. We don't have these open places where they can put their hands, but that we ask them to look at the book or to listen to the book or sit on a carpet and listen while they're being read to. And then we ask them to tell back. So Charlotte Mason used this method called narration, which was an assimilation, that she would read something and she would ask a student to tell it back. And they would tell it back in detail and sequence. And they would also have an understanding of the thought. And they would use the proper nouns and they would use the language of the author. And so they're adding that to their vocabulary. And so when they would tell it back, they'd include all of that. And then when they write, they include all of that. And it's been amazing to hear 5- and 6-year-olds tell the stories back to their parents and then to read them. I mean, we have 6- and 7-year-olds who are telling stories back that are 850 words because they could recall in all those details.
Just a kind of a personal testimony of that part of so you do a 3-day training there in Fredericksburg, and I took probably half of my teachers when I was head of school in for the training. And I remember, I think you were using Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place. And I've read the book before, and there was probably just a page and a half that we focused in on. But we would read a section, we'd turn the book over, and then we'd have to say back what we just read. It was the hardest thing because in our I call it the talk show mentality, we wanted to immediately jump into our opinions or what we thought about it. And you're like, no. What exactly did she say? Was it this or was it that? And then to have to reconstruct it, and you hear it. And when I'd see it in the classrooms, it was unbelievable to hear a group of third graders narrate back a passage, and it sounded like, because they'd been practicing, like they had all memorized it. It was that much detail coming back. So I've thought that, that profoundly impacted me, because that habit of attending, I found even in the few days I was with you, I would go home and I would, read the newspaper, and I was far more intentional of trying to hang on every word and think about what the author said and not jump to my opinion of it. So, I mean, how many discussions do we have that are really more just, the person's interpretation, which again is a very progressive thing, right, David? Because it doesn't really matter what the author intended these days, whatever you felt it intended. Charlotte Mason's dead opposite. It completely matters what the author intended. So
Well, she came from a time when another heretical word these days, submission to the thing was
text,
important.
right.
You're submitting to the text. You're looking at what was actually said, not what your opinion of it is.
Yeah.
And it's important to train that as a habit into young minds.
Yeah. Well, time is short. We may end up going to a backside episode and continue to unpack some of this. But so anything else, Maryellen, talking about that, just the habit of attending and that, yeah.
So I agree with you, David, because one of the things that she said is that you can't necessarily disagree or agree with someone unless you really understood what they said. So that whole idea of submitting to the text is that whether you're looking at a great piece of art, listening to a composer, and we readily sometimes say, I don't like. Well, really, do you understand? And what we found is that when children and adults understand, they often come away with awe and wonder, and their opinions have changed drastically, because what they didn't know is they didn't understand.
Yes, it's no irony that everyone's complaining these days about the shouting matches in the political sphere, because no one's
actually listening to anyone
engaging
else.
each other. They're spouting their opinions.
Barbarian conversation, yes. So just in the final moments, Maryellen, if a parent's listening, if they can't drive quickly to the nearest Ambleside school, which would probably be a good idea, what could they do, just practical things to be aware of, or maybe just how do we help ourselves be more aware of the habits that we're creating in our families?
So one of the first things Charlotte Mason says is to really understand who you are in the child's life. You are the parent. Leonard Sachs wrote a really wonderful book that he entitled The Collapse of Parenting. And I would also add that we could write another book called The Collapse of Teaching. But parents and teachers have a lot of the same responsibilities in bringing children up. And in training children in habit, we need to know who we are, and that we are in authority, but we are also under authority. And as a teacher or a principal, I don't have the choice to not let a child do what he ought to do. That is my job. That is my responsibility. And that's your job and responsibility as a parent too. And that even though you might waffle and wane in that at times, you can get back on the job, as my husband would say, and we can do what we ought to do. But you're not alone. We live in a culture that there's lots of things vying for our attention, but to really be the parent that God called you to be the teacher that God called you to be, is the best way to begin training in habit.
And just in closing, if somebody wants to know more about your work, Charlotte Mason website, where should folks go?
They can go to www.amblesideschools.com.
Great. And I know there's some Bill's and you as well have great videos and just overviews. It's a wealth of resources. So thank you very much. Well, it's great to have you on BaseCamp Live. We'll have to have you back. We've got probably another 57 habits to talk about. I think we just got through a few of them, but it's pretty amazing. So thanks so much.
You're welcome.
All right. See you next time. Thanks.
You've been listening to BaseCamp Live with Davies Owens. Raising the next generation isn't easy, so we hope you're refreshed and encouraged by what you've heard today. And if so, please invite others to listen. You can subscribe at basecamplive.com, and we would invite you to join the conversation about ancient future education. info@basecamplive.com is that address. Please shoot us a message. We'd love to hear from you. And thanks again for joining us.